And so today we're going to start with shifting our thinking. We're going to look a little bit at some of the opportunities, as we talked about this morning, from the pandemic, that notion of the way we've had that time to think. Alan Daly talked about rethinking, reimagining, revisiting, refreshing. And so we're going to take a look at that, some of that work this afternoon. We're going to think about transitioning some of our own thinking around efficacy. And again, it's getting out of the rut that Alan talked about this morning, but much more in line with our own efficacy. And then that self-care that Alison talked about this morning in terms of, if you don't care for yourself, how can you care for others? And the quote that I used about leadership being about the care and support of others. So hopefully Joni's coming back in now. Hi, Joni.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, so we're just on shifting our thinking, and I'm happily handing over to you.
Alrighty. Thanks, Annette. And it is such a pleasure to be back, reconnecting with those of you who I work with, and also the new cohorts of EST. I see messages in the chat that I will respond to, and thank you for your good wishes and welcoming. As Annette mentioned earlier, so wish I could be there in person to be with you, but that's one of the things about COVID. It has certainly created some challenges, but it's also provided some really good opportunities. And I think that as we think about the times that we've been through, it's a good time for me to extend my hope that your family, your loved ones are well, and also to think about how it's transitioned our thinking. What do we think differently about? What have we let go of? What have we added on? And I think that as we chat today, we want to always keep in our focus the opportunities that have been provided to us through the situation. And Simon Breakspear really is quite insightful because he talks about the fact that the pandemic, it's been global. Schools around the world, education around the world has been impacted, whether it's rural, urban, small, large. Everyone has, in fact, bore the brunt of the pandemic. And it has, in changing our thinking, in giving us new insights such as the research would say the pandemic has really brought to bear our values, that values, individual values, organizational values have really emerged during these times, that we have really recognized how important it is that we are all connected. We can't do things alone. We have learned and become more aware of the inequities in our system. And as such, it's helped us to reframe our thinking and to think about things in different ways. So continuing on, as we talk this today, I want us just to go back to a slide that we've used in all of the programs around the 3 fields of knowledge. We have people here in this room who are far more knowledgeable than I am, and you will be able to bring expertise and knowledge when we give you opportunities throughout to connect with your group and to share out. I will share with you some theory and research, some current knowledge around the notion of principal efficacy, as well as taking the research and taking our experiences and our expertise to come up with some reflective thinking and possible next steps going forward. So continuing on, you may recall that during our intros, Annette and I often like to share a quote. And I'm going to ask Annette to speak to the quote that she shared in her introductions and how it connects and has really been impacted, how the quote has impacted her leadership throughout the last few years. Annette?
Thanks, Joni. Yeah, it's strange. I used to think about myself as a messy person as well in amongst this, didn't fit in the box or stay between the lines. But actually, as we've gone through the last months of the pandemic, that messiness is all around, that chaos, that turbulence, that constant complexity and change. And I think I've been so impressed by the integrity of school and system leaders. And I did say it this morning, but I'm coming back to it this afternoon, because they were showing a different loyalty, a loyalty that's always there, but not always as visible. That loyalty to their own communities to make sure everybody got through. So I think my quote has probably just widened out to seeing what's happening in our system within this pandemic time, and how everyone has just shown their integrity and their loyalty in bucket loads to keep children's wheels on their wagons.
You know, such an important insight, Annette, in terms of just how it has reaffirmed your thinking in ways. For those of you that we've met face to face, you know my favorite quote is, "We can't direct the wind, but we can adjust the sails." And I think that this particular quote has really been a quote that's really resonated with me throughout the pandemic in terms of understanding what we can and cannot manage, and even what we can and cannot control. I don't always like to use that word control, but I think that it is a factor. I think what it also has helped me do is really reset priorities in terms of managing and making decisions around things that I can in fact impact, and adjust those sails, as they would say. One of the interesting pieces of research that has emerged through this time is that, you know, strong organizations have become stronger through the pandemic, and organizations that have struggled have continued to struggle, and sometimes struggled more during the pandemic. And I think it speaks to the role of leaders and how we can, in fact, always look to what we can do rather than we can't do. And to me, that's the adjusting the sails. Moving forward, it's that optimism that Annette talked about at the very beginning today, you know, that the optimism, the hope that we can, in fact, move forward in a positive way. So a quote that still sits with me and resonates with me to this day. So continuing on, I recently read a great article by Cecilia Azarin, and the article is going to be part of the resources that we're going to share with you. And for those of you, I have a science background. My teaching was in the area of science, and so this analogy really resonated with me around the life cycle of a star, because in her article she talks about the supernovas. And she says a supernova is an explosion that takes place at the end of a star's life. And then she makes that really interesting connection that COVID-19 marks a supernova of the educational journey of previous decades. She talks about the things, how they will be different going forward. She talks about the energy that is part of that supernova, and the newness, that it really is an opportunity, going back to my opening, an opportunity to really reflect on what we've done, what's worked, what hasn't worked, what we can do differently, and moving forward. So, you know, she calls it beyond COVID-19 supernova is another education coming. And I think what a powerful question. You know, I could say to you, is another education coming in Scotland as a result of our experiences the past few years? And what does it look like? What are you going to hold on to? What are you going to let go of? So things to think about. So a good article that I encourage you to take a look at, and we will provide that for you. So with that in mind, I have selected 6 quotes that are connected to COVID because I think we have to acknowledge the pandemic. It's been an important part of our work the past few years and will continue to be. Just recently reading a good article about the transition from pandemic to endemic and what that means. So I've got 6 quotes. So the opportunity quote is by Azarin, the author that I just mentioned. COVID affords a golden opportunity to rethink what matters most in education. The second quote is around the key. COVID offers possibilities where equity, excellence, and student well-being will be foundational. Michael Fullan and Mary Jean Gallagher. The third talks about the connections, and this is by Jay Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand. COVID-19 highlights how truly interdependent we all are, how reliant we are on cooperation, communication, and compassion. The fourth quote is around shadowing. What is the underlying impact? Well, Mundy and Gallagher Mackay say, educational equity is COVID-19's shadow crisis. Interesting perspective. The fifth quote is around equity. COVID has magnified every existing inequity in our society. Melinda Gates, who I know goes by a different name now, but her quote was in the Gates era. And last but not least, in terms of education, we grew 10 years and 10 months through this pandemic. One of the familiar researchers for Scottish leaders, Simon Breakspear. So in a few moments, we're going to let you go into rooms, and the task at hand will be next. In your breakout space, you'll find your group number along the top of your screen. Please discuss the quote for your group and record 2 insights on the Padlet in preparation for a gallery walk. So we want to have a conversation about this quote. Does it resonate with you? What does it have to do with leadership? What does it have to do with your work going forward? And record 2 insights that you believe would be valuable for your colleagues to hear. And then the gallery walk will be set up, and we'll have a chance to share that out. So your groupings will be, for opportunity, it will be group 1 and 2, continuing on. 1, 2, and 3, excuse me. Groups 4 and 5 for key, for interdependence, 6 and 7, equity 8, shadow 8 and 9, equity 10 and 11, and growth 12 and 13. So at this time, you're going to be given the link to go into your groups. We're going to give you about 10 minutes to go into your learning groups, and then we will come back and talk about how these insights connect to efficacy going forward. So I'll turn it over to Annette.
Okay, so we are going to put the Padlet link into the chat pane, and here you are. So if you click on the Padlet link to open before you go, then Chris will magic you into random discussion groups for the conversation around this.
So thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed your time with your colleagues. And I'm just taking a look, Allison's just sharing with us some of the comments. And as I take a look at your insights, what it reminds me of is just those opportunities that this pandemic has provided, that as leaders, for us to be able to look at how we can build on those opportunities, how we can present to those around us that optimism, that hope, that reframing the situation into a positive, and that this is a great opportunity to move forward. And when I say that, I don't mean unrealistic optimism. There needs to be acknowledgement of the impact, the impact on people. So it's not about disregarding that, but how do we, when we have that opportunity? How do we reframe and use this to learn, to use our learning going forward in a positive way? So thanks very much for this. And I am going to capture and take another look at these later, because there's lots of really, really good thinking there. So thank you very much.
And Joni, we will download the comments and send them out to everybody so you've all got them to share.
Excellent, thank you. So continuing on with the PowerPoint. Right. So the next slide comes back to the work that we did around efficacy. And we know that efficacy is one of those personal leadership resources that we talked about in Module 3, that when people are optimistic, they believe they can make a difference, they then are more likely to persevere through the challenges, to continue to not necessarily just bounce back, but to bounce forward. And so I identified efficacy as a topic for our discussion today because it is such an important part of those psychological resources and key to moving from being hopeful to really enacting and helping others to be resilient. So I want to begin by just reminding you of the Bandura definition around efficacy, which will not be new to you, but to just remind you that it's a belief about ability and not always actual ability, because that's important to keep in mind. When we think about, if we could move along to the next slide, you'll see where that self-efficacy fits into the big picture, because it's really when all three of these resources are working together that it helps us to be more successful as leaders. Continuing. If we think about during the pandemic, and again I'm drawing on Simon Breakspeare's research here, he talks about during the pandemic there's a perceived loss of control, that in many situations and in all sectors, people lacked the experience. They hadn't been through this before, so they lacked the experience and they lacked evidence to be able to know what to do next. And it was very much an unknown timeline. So all of those things created an unsettlement within our leadership, within the work that we were doing. Where efficacy becomes really important is that when we are efficacious, when we are self-efficacious, when we are able to create the conditions for collective efficacy within our learning teams, within our staff, it gives us the opportunity to exercise some control. We're able to identify what we can and can't do. We're able to identify the actions that we can take going forward rather than being limited by what we can't do. The role of self-fulfilling prophecies within efficacy is really important too. You know, I think back to how many times have I heard students, colleagues say, you know what, someone believed in me. When I didn't think I could do it, they believed in me, and how that's had such an impact. And you know, as I look out to the group, every one of you has made that difference for at least one, and I know more than that, in terms of giving people this believing in them. You know, the other thing that really becomes so powerful in this is that when we believe we can do something, it actually releases endorphins in our body, which gives us energy to do it. So there's not only the emotional impact, but also the physical impact to enable us to persevere over time. So that's why I felt that efficacy was a really important topic, because I think it really will help us to navigate and lead going forward. Carrying on, there's also some excellent research around the notion of principal and school leader efficacy. So the first one is from the Wallace Foundation. Principal efficacy is a key link in the chain joining district initiatives, or Education Scotland initiatives, school conditions, and student learning. So we know that when people are efficacious, when leaders are efficacious, it helps give them the energy, the focus to persevere, which helps to make the connections between the initiatives, the conditions, and the learning. The second quote, which is quite interesting, talks a bit about, when we look at the research, the Wallace Foundation in 2021 just did a recent study around the impact of school leaders. And what's interesting is that it brings out some of Goddard's research, his 2020 research, Goddard's 2020 research, in that initially they, you've heard the quote from Leithwood, and we used in EST about, leadership is second only to teacher influence. And the initial research around school leader efficacy and improved outcomes, student outcomes, was actually quite low. The impact effect size was actually quite low. But what has emerged in more recent research is how the school leader's efficacy, where it makes difference, is it helps to build teacher collective efficacy, which we know improves student outcomes. And so that's a really interesting shift. If I was doing this information even 5 years ago, the effect size was quite low, but much more robust research around that, which makes it more important, because when we can make that linkage, it helps us to better identify the need to do it, to be aware of it, and to be intentional about building our own efficacy. The third quote focuses in on, why does it improve student success? Well, you may remember, and I'm going back quite a few years, but we talked about first and second order change. We talked about second order change in EST and around adaptive leadership. And adaptive leadership is about doing the hard work. It's where we have to engage others. We can't fix it. We have to include others. There will be resistance. It takes time. It wears leaders down. And in fact, Michael Fullan has that great quote where he says, it wears people down. So many great initiatives have been dismissed, have been abandoned, because the leaders are just worn out. And, as I read that, I thought, I've been there. I remember those situations. And so that's where, again, the efficacy becomes important, because the efficacy, when we're self-efficacious, we are more likely to sustain our effort and to persevere. And so it speaks to just how important, in all times, but particularly now, that we really pay attention to our own efficacy as a leader, whether that's a school leader or a system leader. This research was specific to school leader, but I'm broadening it out to our talk around system leaders also. So as part of the preparation for our time together today, Annette sent out to you a leader efficacy scale. And this comes from the research of Tashan Moran, who, as part of the resources that we're going to send to you, we're going to send you to her link, because she has some really good efficacy scales, not only for school leaders, but for teachers. She's done some tremendous work around trust, and that's another resource actually I can send to Annette to post following our discussion today. But she has some really good thinking around how to assess efficacy. And so we sent the link out to you, and in terms of the results, we have a small sample to draw upon. So as I share some of the results with you, there's a couple of things I need to be very clear about, in that, the results are not statistically significant in that the number of the sample. However, I am going to share them with you for a couple of reasons, because I want you to think a little bit about these statements. You will have a hard copy of the questionnaire sent to you following our session today, and I encourage you to take the time to complete it. You will see that when we share some of the trends, there are some trends that would align very clearly with the research. And so I am going to share that with you, but I want to just clarify that we cannot make assumptions or draw conclusions from this. So going on to the first slide and the first statements. So this is the screenshot that comes from Mentimeter, a great little resource to use. So I have the school leaders and we have the 6 statements that started the survey. And if we could just pull up the system leaders for just a second also. What I'd like you to just be aware of here is, first of all, look at the statements. Think about how you would respond or how you did respond. You know, to what extent do you believe you're able to lead student learning? Now, in the survey, it talks about facilitate student learning. And so we made that one distinction there. You know, to what extent are you able to handle the time demands of the job? Well, when we look at this, I think there's a couple things that are significant. And throughout the whole survey, there was very clear alignment between, in almost all, between school leaders and system leaders. The differential was not significantly different in a lot of them. One where there was a little bit of difference and would be in the area of managing change in your school. If you look at that particular visual, it shows you the bell curve for that. It also gives you sort of an average around that. And you'll see that between school leaders, 4.5, 1 being the low end of the scale, 5 being the high end of the scale, and in system leaders, the 3.4. So that's probably, well, it's a statement that had the most difference, which I think is interesting. And then I have no answers for that. I wonder about the notion of intent and impact, but my purpose here is not to draw conclusions because for the reasons I stated initially, but to just take a look at these things and to be more aware of them. The next slide is the next statements, and again, I'm just going to give you a minute to look at them. There were a couple of interesting statements here in terms of the raising student achievement on national and standardized tests. To me, that's a really important one in terms of going forward. You know, what do we believe? How do we message to those whom we lead? How does our efficacy on that statement impact what we communicate to others? How does our efficacy around a positive image of our school and the media, how does that impact public confidence? How does our efficacy around motivating teachers impact the quality of teachers? We know how important, Leithwood says, leadership after the quality of teachers. So how does that impact that? So things to think about. And the last slide is the last few statements. And I'll give you a minute just to take a look at them. And again, in this case, a few where there was a little bit of a discrepancy or not discrepancy, but differential. But again, a lot of areas where the system and school leaders were thinking along the same ideas, because school leaders were, I should have probably mentioned this at the beginning, but, to what extent can you do this? And the system leader survey was, to what extent do you believe school leaders can do this? Okay. So just some things to think about and really to create more wonderings and questions than to make any conclusions. So I'd like to dig deeper into these statements, and Tasha Moran categorizes these statements into management actions, instructional leadership. Oh, if we can just go back one, just instructional leadership actions, and moral leadership actions. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into this. And our first one is management. So the management statements, and we've included those there, so I've pulled those from the survey. Okay. Give me a minute. And continuing to the next slide. So we're going to give you a little bit of time to think more deeply about these particular statements from the management lens. And the lens we're going to use to think about these statements is a lens that will be familiar to you from EST, and that is the Covey Urgent and Important Matrix. We know that the matrix, and if we can pull the matrix up, please. The important and urgent. We know that the most effective leaders spend their time in quadrant 2. Okay. We know that the ability to reflect on, to be aware, to pay attention to urgency and important does impact our daily schedule. It does impact how we prioritize. And so what we'd like to do is we're going to have you go into some breakout rooms again. And your task is, if we can just pull it up next, is I'd like you to review your thoughts around the management efficacy statements. So take a look at those statements, reflect on how would I respond to those? And in your rooms, reflect and discuss the practices through the urgent and important lens. So what does our mindset in terms of urgent and important, how does that impact our efficacy around management? How can we utilize this framework to help us build and enrich our efficacy in management practices? Annette has put together a mural in the breakout room, and we're going to ask that you provide at least one insight per statement, connecting the efficacy, building our efficacy in this area and the quadrants of the matrix. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it to Annette to give you some further instructions and timing.
Okay, folks, so the mural link is in the chat pane, and we used Mural this morning, so I'm sure most of you will be fairly familiar with it. It's pulling the little post-its in from the left-hand side of the screen and putting them into the appropriate boxes, one box per question. So we'll give you 20 minutes to do this. Please take as much time as you need for the conversation. It would be nice if we could get one in each at least, but the conversation is the important part of this. So if you can't make it work, don't stress about it, just enjoy the conversation. The link's there. Chris is moving you now into breakout spaces, and we'll see you in 20 minutes.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. And we've been watching the mural develop while you've been working, and I just wanted to make maybe just 2 comments around that. As we look at the mural, I think that what is significant is that the prioritizing demands is the one that generated a lot of thinking. It generated what I really appreciate from you is some strategies going forward that can help with prioritizing the demands, because I do believe that when we're able to prioritize the demands, then the handling the paperwork, the daily scheduling, some of those other factors just come into, are also addressed through that. When these are sent out to you, I'd encourage you to take a look at some of the strategies that your colleagues have presented to you, and also to keep in mind the quote from Covey where he said, "It is not about prioritizing our schedule. It is about scheduling our priorities." And being able to schedule the priorities, keeping in mind, being reminded of the urgent. Now, as we reflect on the past 2 years, the pandemic itself has required us to be in the urgent quadrant more often because there were things that we had to deal with in the crisis that had to be dealt with first. And so I think that as you continue to work, as we continue to navigate the pandemic, the endemic going forward, I just want to remind you of that quote around, take a look at that schedule and be sure that you're scheduling your priorities. Decide what your priorities are, what's important, what is important in your schools, in your school, in terms of student achievement and well-being, and to just be reminded of that. And the activity that we talked about in EST, where actually color coding the quadrants in your calendar, your diary. Go back on a week and do that can be quite insightful in terms of helping us to be more aware of that. So thanks for those great thoughts and ideas. The second category of statements is focused on the notion of instructional leadership. And so when we take a look at that particular slide around motivating teachers, enthusiasm for shared vision, change, positive learning environment, student learning, raising student achievement, really, really powerful statements, really important statements to think about. And so in terms of this discussion, I want to share with you the next slide, which will have the statements restated. We'll also have the framework or the lens that we're going to use. And the lens that we're going to use for this discussion is from the Center for Creative Leadership, which is University of Washington based. They talk about 4 dimensions of instructional leadership. And I know there's many different dimensions. Peter DeWitt also has a great set of dimensions. And I know you've done quite a bit of work with Peter DeWitt, so I purposely selected a different framework just to kind of frame your thinking. Vision, mission, and culture building, the improvement of instructional practice, the allocation of resources, and the management of people and processes are the 4 dimensions that they identify as being integral to instructional leadership. So when we go into our breakout groups this time, and you're going to be there a shorter length of time, probably just 10 minutes because you're accustomed to the process, I want you to think about these 6 statements because this instructional leadership, that's the core of what we do. And, think about these statements and think about, a few of the questions I posed as we looked at those around change and teachers and raising student achievement. And think about how do those dimensions connect to those statements. And again, we're going to ask you to post a mural and talk a little bit about it, about your leadership going forward, and post just 1 or 2 ideas that you think your colleagues need to keep in mind as they reflect on those particular 6 statements. So I'll pass it to Annette.
Okay, thanks, Joni. The mural link is in the chat pane now, ready for you to go, and it works exactly the same as the last one, so hopefully it'll be fairly straightforward to you. And Chris, as we speak, is putting you back into the same groups so that you can continue the conversation around efficacy that you were having earlier. So we'll see you back at 26 minutes past 3.
Your thinking posted, I see lots of really powerful EST concepts coming out in this. And I think what I'd like you to think about is to just take a minute and look at the strategies under Motivate Teachers, because we know how important that is. And there's a lot of really good ideas there in terms of empowerment, in terms of trust, in terms of creating the conditions. I love Avis Glaze talks about, the role of the school leader or the system leader is to create the conditions for others to do their very best work for our students. And I think that emerges in several of your posts, your post-its here. The other area that I wanted just to talk a little about was the creative, the positive learning environment. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper into that one in the next slide. But the notion of facilitating student learning, the raising student achievement, I think the raising student achievement is also an important one to take a look at. And I go back to, and again, I'm going back to a concept that we talked about in EST, where we talked about internal and external accountability, and if you kind of remember that discussion and that visual where, the external accountability are our national tests, our national achievement testing that we are accountable to. And then our internal accountability is our accountability to our beliefs, our values, our priorities within our school. And those two have to intersect. We have to be able to intersect our internal priorities, our in-school priorities with the external priorities. And it's the role of the leader to be able to identify that intersection, because how we communicate national testing, national assessments, how we communicate that to those whom we lead will have a significant impact in how it is perceived by them and the efficacy they will have around it and the actions going forward. So just a little kind of going back to the EST messaging and how it connects to that efficacy in student achievement. So thanks for your excellent thoughts. Continuing on, our third category was the notion of moral leadership. And we're not going to go into breakout rooms for moral leadership, but I wanted just to take a look at those 6 statements and just encourage you to think about them in the terms of creating that positive learning environment, which was on the previous slide. And when we think about positive learning environment, I've drawn from the Ministry of Education climate document, which talks about 6 things that we need to be aware of when we're creating a positive learning climate. And when I say learning, positive learning culture, learning climate, it's for students, staff, families, community. It's for everyone. One is the notion of student voice. And I would add to that student agency. Interesting, again, research around the past 2 years and how schools, organizations that had strong student agency.
Hello, Francis. What have you been doing?
Have been able to continue their work going forward. That strong agency of students has enabled the shift to online learning and has been very powerful in terms of them being successful. OECD has a great document around student agency that has some excellent strategies that if that's an area that you're looking to, reflect on in your own situation, I encourage you to look at that, and I'll send that to Annette for distribution. The importance of parent and family engagement and community partnerships has never been so powerful as it has been the past 2 years. We couldn't do it alone. We needed to engage our families and our communities to work together. I think one of the things that comes out of the learning environment is that we now know that the learning environment isn't just within the walls of the school. We already knew that before, but I think we even are more aware of all the possibilities, the importance of wellness, and that people feel safe and accepted in all situations. So I think those moral leadership statements, which overall had really a higher level of efficacy, both within system and school leaders. So it is obviously perceived as a strength. And so I just wanted to share that framework to, perhaps just put a few thoughts and questions for you to think about in your own situation. So continuing on, I have taken those statements, and so if you think about the moral leadership are the statements that are in purple, and generate enthusiasm, I'm just going to back up here. The statements in purple are the moral leadership statements, and there was a lot of agreement between school and system leaders around those in terms of efficacy, the level of efficacy. In terms of generating enthusiasm for shared vision, and managing change, which are instructional leadership. There was managing change was considered high efficacy for from the perspective of school leaders, but less so with system leaders, and we talked about that earlier. And my generate enthusiasm for shared vision should have been up at the top, but you know how no matter how many times you look at something, sometimes things pop up. So, but the purpose of sharing this is to help you think about, you know, where do the high efficacy statements, practices, where do they fall? Well, they're falling based on just some of the information, the small piece that we've gathered, moral leadership. Okay. Now let's look at the lower efficacy statements, which is our next slide. And I think what's interesting here is seeing that many more of the management and leadership practices are falling into the lower efficacy. Okay. And I don't have the answers for that, but it's an observation. Okay. As well as a couple of instructional leadership are a little bit different around raising student achievement from school leaders' perspective and managing change from system. So with that in mind, I want to just pose a couple of wonderings to you, and no answers. We're not going to do a breakout room for this, but the first wondering is, raising student achievement on national and standardized tests, 3.8 system leaders, okay, 1 to 5 being the range, 3.3 school leaders. Just a reminder about the discussion I shared with you just previously around internal and external accountability and the message that is being given by you as a school and system leader. The second wondering, leaders report lower levels of efficacy in enacting management practices. How does this impact instructional leadership? Does it? The third wondering, managing change had the greatest differential between school leaders and system leaders. Why? What is it about managing change that may create that little bit of differential? The fourth wondering, creating a positive image of the school in the media, 3.8 system leaders, 3.3 school leaders. How does that impact public confidence? If our efficacy is a bit lower in terms of creating that positive image, how does that impact public confidence in what we're doing and the great work you're doing? And last but not least, the notion of motivating teachers. The average was 3.8 for both groups. You know, it's in the upper range, and at the same time knowing how important it is. What can we do? How can we use our own and build our own efficacy to build collective efficacy? You know, to build on the work of Donahue, to build on the work of DeWitt and Katz to create those conditions for collective teacher efficacy. So no answers, but always questions to wonder about. Continuing on, I like this quote around, if I have the belief that I can do it, I shall surely acquire the capacity to do it, even if I may not have it at the beginning. So when we think about that, I'd like to just share 4 next steps. And the 4 next steps are based on the Bandura actions, conditions that build self-efficacy. When we think about mastery, encourage you to celebrate your success, to set achievable goals, but not easy goals. Okay? In terms of observing others, surround yourself, if we could just back up, please, to the other side. In terms of observing others, surround yourself by highly effective leaders. As you think about your networking group, or perhaps think about your mentor, because we talked in EST about the difference between the two, surround yourself by highly effective leaders. Be challenge yourself by learning from others, observing others, speaking with others. Seek positive affirmations. We want a balance of positive and growth-producing feedback, but ensure that you are, in fact, exposing yourself to people who will help you to identify the things you can do, the things that you are doing, important in terms of efficacy. And last but not least, the notion of emotional intelligence, which we spent a lot of time in Module 3 on, but particularly when we think about efficacy, it's around that self-management skills, being that self-awareness and self-management that help us to be efficacious in our work. So as we begin to close out our time together, I want to just think about reflection, and I want to remind you of this really, really important quote that will be familiar to you. And I'm not going to read the quote, but I am going to summarize it in terms of, we know that others can give us feedback, and that's important, and we need to listen to feedback. We need to be willing to accept that feedback, to process it, and to identify how it can help us be better leaders. And at the same time, we need to reflect and give ourselves feedback. We need to be really authentic in terms of identifying our strengths, our areas for growth. We need to be aware of our blind spots. We need to do all of those things that will help us to generate our next steps, our actions going forward. Because when we do that, then there is a commitment for us to work on those actions. We're going to persevere with them. Where sometimes other people's feedback can be more feeling like I need to be compliant, and what we really want is commitment. I'd like you just to take a moment and to next part of the slide, please, to reflect on your individual level of efficacy. If you haven't had a chance to do the survey, I encourage you, and I know you have many things on your plate, but at some point to take a look at that and to do it, and to think about, where are the things that you're feeling efficacious in, what are the actions that you want to reflect on and maybe grow in that area, and what are you going to do to increase and nurture it. Okay, there's the 4 steps that I mentioned previously, but there's also lots of really good research around that. So I want you to start with yourself, because that's a really important starting point. And then from there, going on to the next slide, I want you to think about where we started, where I talked about the fact that school leaders' efficacy significantly predicted teacher collective efficacy. And I know you've been doing a lot of work around that. You've done work around the Donahue strategies and so forth. And so it's a kind of that whole, remember we always started with why? It kind of is the start with you, because as your own efficacy builds, then what are your next steps to increase, nurture, and enrich the individual efficacy of those whom you lead? How will you build the collective efficacy of the teams that you lead? Because we know that research is very clear and continues to grow around the impact of collective efficacy in terms of improving student outcomes. So my hope is that our time today has been a time to reflect on your efficacy, to think about how important it is in all times, but particularly now, and to better understand the need to start with you and your efficacy in terms of growing collective teacher efficacy down the road. So in a moment, I'm going to turn it back to Annette, but before then, I just want to say it has been such a pleasure to be back with the group, to see familiar faces on the screen, to see your messages, just warms my heart. And so I hope that you and your families continue to be safe, continue the great and important work you're doing. I know that there's lots of change afoot around moving forward in Scotland education. And so I just wanted to wish you the best, and to also take this time right now to thank Annette, as always, for her leadership in doing this, Alison, Stephanie, and all the people behind the scenes, these that have been so instrumental in, first of all, giving me the opportunity to work with you again, but also our time together today. So until then, stay well, and I wish you all the very best. And I'm only an email away, so don't hesitate to reach out. So please take care. Annette?
Joni, thank you. We are just so privileged to have you with us today. You know we love you and the learning that you provide for us. It's been such a joy. And as Sharon said, we just wish we were face to face. So we are going to have one last conversation. And if we move on to the last slide, please, Steph, we're just going to have a little bit of feedback and thoughts on your learning today, because it's really important for us to take some recognition of what you've learned today, what you would like to learn again, how you would like to come together. But we're going to do it as a group conversation. So if you could all please click on the link that Alison's just put in the chat pane to open the Microsoft Forms. And while you're doing that, Chris will take you into groups of 6 to have that final conversation together about what you've learned today and what you might like to see coming forward. So, Chris, when you're ready, we can go into the chat pane, please. Steph, can you go back a slide for me, please? And we'll come back together in probably 6-7 minutes. We'll just give you a bit of time to have that conversation, do the evaluation, and then come back together. Thanks a lot. Gosh, we're actually going to be finished on time. Gaynor, did you not get into a group? Still see Gaynor's name there. I'm just wondering if she's still with us. Joni, that was just fabulous. Afternoon, and I haven't told you at any point in the day that we were recording it. So could I just say to you, please, if you have an objection to it being shared, please email me before Monday, because I'll start to send out things next Monday. So we will send out the PowerPoints for both morning and afternoon, any of the professional reading references, any of the documents that we have, and all of the hyperlinks. I'll also send you the 3rd video that linked together the work this morning from Alan Daly, which was Dr. David Vasserdal talking about how they put the social network research together in their own area. I think it's probably too big a piece of research to just lift and look at wholesale, but some of the thinking behind that might be really helpful for you. Joni's going to send me some other resources that she's mentioned today, and these will all come out to you at the beginning of the next week. Can I just say thank you so much to you all for setting this time aside to come together. We realise how tricky things are out in the system, and how capacity in schools has been really diminished with staff absence and head teachers picking up the drop-offs in staff, and know that you are all just doing the most amazing job to keep the wheels on the wagon. So thank you for that. Thank you for coming today. Joni, just wonderful having you with us. We've really enjoyed it. And while you were away doing the evaluation, Joni has come up with a whole new program about system leadership that we think we're going to write together. So there'll always be something else coming. If you would like to be involved in alumni events again, I'm sure we will continue this. I should just say I'm retiring in the spring, so I'm passing the mantle on to Alison in our collective for school and system leaders. So I'm definitely hoping that there'll be more alumni events. So lovely to see you all. We are finishing a wee bit early, but I think you deserve it. You've been really hanging in with us all day today. So thanks ever so much, everybody. I'll be in touch next week.